So, our second speaker today in this session is Richard Brown. So, Richard has over 20 years of experience in the UK civilian and military nuclear industries. In fact, according to his bio, he has spent 6.5 years underwater. It's pretty impressive if you ask me. It tells me that's equivalent to about primary school level. So, is there anyone in this room who's spent longer than 6.5 years underwater? Oh, there's a couple. How long? 7. Oh, 7. Ooh, okay. There's no more than decade people here, so 6.5 years is pretty good. So Richard has a lot of experience in nuclear. He's also doing a PhD right now on nuclear safety principles, which is pretty cool. He's a colleague of mine from KBR, and today he's going to talk to us about the 3 keys to successfully operating a nuclear-powered submarine. I won't tell you what they are. I'll let him do it.
Thank you, Joe. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. I can be rather loud, so I just want to try and measure the distance. So yes, 6.5 years underwater, and in 2008, I only saw 11 days of daylight due to back-to-back patrols. So it does give you a different context in life. I'd like to thank Mark for allowing me the opportunity to come and talk. And for Jazz, just before we came in, I was asked, why would anyone want to become a submariner? Why would you want to join and become a submariner and say goodbye to the daylight? When I went to my Admiralty interview board, they asked me, why do you want to join the submarine service? Now, at that time, I was a trooper. That's a rifleman in the army. And when I went there, I couldn't think of anything to say. I was a little bit nervous, and I wasn't as funny as I thought I was. So my response to them was, do you know what, sir? It's so that I can grab the gobstick or the microphone. Now, that is the microphone that allows you to transmit right across the submarine. And my response was, so that I can say, I can't do it, Captain. I'm giving it all she's got. At least you laughed. I didn't even get a smile, and I thought I'd failed. So, okay, as Joe says, I'm an engineer first. I'm a nuclear engineer by trade. I've operated nuclear submarines. I've maintained them. I've also been an authorisee. Now, an authorisee in Australian context is a licensee. So I've operated land-based nuclear reactors, prototype reactors as well. And in a room like this, when I'm faced with my peers, I'm a little bit coy when I say I'm also a social scientist. Because really, is it a real science? I don't know. But I'm undertaking a research degree, as Joe was saying, and that research degree is in understanding how we think about nuclear safety, what shapes our processes, what shapes how we're actually approaching it, and what we're going to think to it. I'm fascinated by people and understanding how we operate. Now, my first mentor, Peter Foster, he said to me, as an engineer, you can fix anything. People, on the other hand, will continue to terrify you and amaze you on a daily basis. And we've all seen what happens when we get technical types in the same room. We're all arguing the same perspective. We're all doing it from a slightly different perspective, point of view. Our voices get higher. We think in ones and zeros. We think up, down, and we forget that we're actually emotional beings. Now, when I was first invited to speak here, I was undertaking a different type of role. And now I'm working within KBR and under their engineering and assurance roles. We have a team where we have design, safety case engineers, we do nuclear assurance, systems engineers, and we're supporting a wide range of clients and projects. Why do I share this? Well, as I was listening earlier, do I say it's just a blatant sales pitch, or is it just something that I'm doing? But I've found my happy place. I found a place where people speak the same language. We speak in the same context. We understand what it means when we say things. And everything that we do at KBR is underpinned by the same 3 tenets of what is on the presentation for safety, training, and regulation. But when we talk to these things, whichever one you put in first, we need to understand that they are not siloed approaches. Now, my presentation title makes it look like they're a siloed approach. That's not the case. And we'll talk more to it later. And before we begin, let's start talking about credibility and legitimacy and what we're trying to achieve. Over the last few years, I've heard different variations of the word demonstrable. And I actually have an affinity for this word. I don't know why, I just really like the word. So to demonstrate means to provide a practical exhibition or an explanation. Makes sense. Demonstrable means that we can show or prove something, and it refers to the ability to demonstrably show that it can be done. Demonstrative use is a similar sort of term, but it is used often in terms of describing what we feel, how we intend something. And my personal favorite, demonstratable. The Oxford English Dictionary, the American English Dictionary, and the Australian English Dictionary will reference this as not a real word. It was first used in the 15th century and it is now cited as a mispronunciation of the two words above, and it is becoming commonly accepted, but it doesn't mean anything. So now we're going to look at another one, and this second point is looking at language, and this is what we want to do within these three tenets of safety, training, and regulation through insurance and assurance. So they're intrinsically linked. Insurance, or to ensure, it's a verb. It conveys the idea of making certain that something is going to happen. The IAEA Fundamental Safety Principle number 1, now it states that the prime responsibility for safety must rest with the person or organization for facilities and activities that give rise to radiation risk. So the development of safety and training, it's the responsibility of the operator. And so is the self-assessment. So you're actually self-regulating. But that leads to the assurance. So when we're talking about assurance, the operator and the regulator must demonstrably prove how the operator meets the requirements. The regulator has a sole function of assurance, and it is looking at it from the perspective of watching the watcher. So to understand this further, the operator ensures that their crews are correctly trained. They've got the right instruction. They're appropriately at a point in their career where they can do the right job. So insurance talks about the activity of training, whereas assurance can be through the activity of, for example, an assessment, an exam, a peer review board. And when we talk about language, and we'll talk about this more in the end, submariners have a very unique approach to speaking. All right, we'll talk about this more in the end. So when we come to insurance, no. In this context, we do not talk about it. Insurance and assurance, we are not talking about insurance. That's something you can go and get for your car. So our language must be clear and concise, must be without any ambiguity. But why is this important? Am I just being picky and a finicky pom? Am I just over-exaggerating the language of my mother tongue and how we speak? But our language, our behavior, our attitudes, they support our credibility. Now, as we say, submariners have a very typical patter, delivery, communication style. So much so that it is very clear, it is very concise, so much so that you might think that we're being rude, too direct, or brash. But we want to be able to communicate something quickly with the intent of it being understood. So when we talk to our three tenets, we want to be able to remove that ambiguity and apply a collaborative and logical approach. And now this in itself is actually described by game theory. And game theory talks about the communication and interaction within these three tenets. Now, in this example, I don't know if it'll be picked up, but it could be as simple as something as simple as pacifically talking to the three tenets, irregardless of the application of the words used. We start to undermine our credibility if we don't get it right. And if we're going to do that, we start to use the book of unimpossible words, and we lose all legitimacy in everything that we try and achieve. This could be something simple as your God or your God. Now, there are different variations of this, but in terms of saying it, it sounds the same thing, but our intent is different. Could also be on a submarine context, confirm the state of the valve. The actual answer to this one is confirmed. It doesn't tell you anything. You've got no idea of the status of your system or where it is. What you actually want to say is report the state of the valve. The answer to that is the valve is open or shut. It just helps us understand where we are in that very clear and concise approach. Now, in terms of transparency, I've operated or served on SSNs, although majority of my career was served on SSBNs. And I don't know if people are really that familiar with the difference between these, so I'm just going to highlight that quickly. And when we talk about the comparison here of the Astute class SSN and the Vanguard class SSBN, when we say SSN, that means Ship Submersible Nuclear. Yes, nuclear submarine, but when we talk about an SSBN, that is a Ship Submersible Ballistic Nuclear. They are both nuclear-powered submarines, they're just different context. Both of these operate with a PWR2 core. They are principally the same. The operational profile, however, is significantly different. The core burn profile is different, the operational intent, but it's still underpinned by the same core tenets of safety, regulation, and training. Now let's see if this one works. SSNs are versatile. They have the option to travel globally. They can circumnavigate the world submerged. They can dive below the North Pole. And operations range from surveillance, asset retrieval, force deployment, hunting other submarines, or targeting surface ships. They're fast, they're stealthy, and they have the versatility to undertake a number of different mission profiles. They can deploy for long periods of time, so 9, 12 months. But during that time, they will have port visits, they will do resupply, they will do crew respite and change out. Now, to understand an SSBN, we have to look at the SSBN in its natural habitat. So we have to zoom in very closely to a part of the world. An SSBN only has one role. To understand that, it carries the nuclear deterrent. And once it's dived, it will remain out of contact for the entire 3 to 6 months. So that is 3 to 6 months without seeing daylight. A UK patrol recently completed just over 200 days at sea. So now imagine that. It's not just a short thing. And by the way, when you're deployed like that, you have no contact with the outside world whatsoever. Now, this cycle of that continuous at-sea deterrent has never been broken, which means that the at-sea culture that we have must also reflect what happens at ashore. And we have very robust assurances at ashore. But we don't have a regulator on board, so we have to become very self-regulatory in what we do. So it's really worth understanding the different pipelines that we are talking to. And sorry, Kath actually talked to this a few moments ago, but we're talking about the nuances of different pipelines within the US and the UK. Now, we currently have trainees undertaking both pipelines through the different regimes. And this means that at some point, those personnel are going to return to Australia with two different approaches. They're going to return to Australia whilst we're establishing our own regulatory framework that is going to be shaped and informed by their experiences. We're going to have to do safety and training, which is an insurance activity that is going to be underpinned by their experiences. And as you can see, both of the both of the training pipelines offer similarities for the training of those potential candidates. And by the way, BRNC is the Britannia Royal Naval College. On the right-hand side, OSC is the US Officer School for Cadets. AMEO, DMEO, and MEO. So you have up to three AMEOs on a ship. That is the assistant, the deputy, and the marine engineering officer. And on the right-hand side, we have the engineering officer of the watch, and we have the officer on deck. So the UK train on very sophisticated simulators that reflect the operation of both the core and the engine spaces. So they can simulate everything that goes on the boat, and we can use that to predict what's going to happen. Whereas the US will train on a prototype reactor, and that is a real submarine reactor that is land-based at Gooseneck, South Carolina. So the 2 points here that I really want to convey is both pathways ultimately go towards delivering highly trained personnel. But the first point really there is our partners within the AUKUS enterprise have two different approaches. But they do ensure that their personnel and the core itself, through their regulatory systems, meet the regulatory requirements. And the second point is, for both of these training pipelines, before you can be entrusted to be an engineering head of department, you are looking at 10 years of experience. That means not only do we have the qualification, we now have 10 years of operational experience on a submarine, which underpins the confidence that the operator and the regulator has in us to manage that nuclear plant. Now, when we see that submarine, when we see the submarine transit along the surface, we don't often consider what's beneath the surface. And you may not ever in your lifetime get to see a submarine on the surface. And just by the way, a ship typically can have around 20% positive buoyancy. A submarine only has 5% positive buoyancy. So if you think of it from that context, think about just how much is below what you can't see. But figuratively, what we can't see is proportional to these three tenets. And it's in this context that the overarching drivers behind safety, training, and regulation, even on an operational submarine, once we're away from the wharf, it's not an afterthought. These are priority considerations in everything that we do. It is instilled in us from day one. So when we look at, in this example here, when we look at systems integrity, and we can actually apply general system theory here, and that suggests that system integrity in itself comprises of the operator, their training, the integrity of the system and the robust mechanisms and assurances that go into the design, of both the primary system and the secondary system. And we assure that integrity through daily, weekly, monthly checks. So whilst you're on a submarine, whilst you're deployed, we have to do daily, weekly, monthly checks. During a 4-hour watch, we have to do routine checks. We do records and observations. We do a watch handover. Now, that watch handover is an opportunity for me to tell my relief what I've done, for them to challenge me, for them to actually understand what we're doing, what we've done, what we're doing now, and where we're going to, so that they have that whole picture. It follows the same pattern. Our at-sea activities mirror the ashore-based infrastructure. So whether you're on a UK or a US SSN, our assurance activities are aligned to meet the overarching safety case, the operational safety of the reactor, and the regulatory requirements that underpin that. And when we talk about assurance, really we're just talking about regulation. And then finally, we have currency and competency. We do weekly forums. That is, throughout an entire patrol, we are constantly training every day, every watch, every week. The continuation training of new joiners is one of the best ways to stay current. You have people with you at all times and you're training them to be your relief. We have to train the new trainee engineers that are coming through. Because we train on simulators, we have to do live plant drills. So we actually put the reactor on the boat through live plant drills. And those training records are returned to ashore to provide that demonstrable assurance that we are competent in the role that we can do. And all of these are underpinned by a cultural approach. This is the people component of what it is. We have the technology, we have these systems, but it's actually the people. So it's with this in mind that we start widening out our understanding of safety regulation and training. It's not just the submarine, it's across the entire pathway. And at every stage of that asset life cycle, these tenants are underpinning the culture that Australia will see in its own SSN. However, and this is a big however, we're in the unusual position. The Virginia-class submarine has already been designed, operated, proven, tested. We're not actually designing it, so we're not learning from that design. But we are designing the future AUKUS SSN. And we're developing a training regime that is going to complement both the Virginia-class training here and the future SSN. And we're supporting the development of a regulatory framework. We are trying to do the entire asset life cycle in one hit. That is no mean feat. That is a huge challenge for people to undertake and appreciate in what it is that we're trying to do. And of course, regulation in this instance is underpinned by the regulatory framework. But just remember that the same regulatory framework applies across every different aspect of the asset lifecycle. It's just contextual. We have to apply that understanding and nuanced understanding of what it is because it is contextual at every stage. That doesn't mean that it's complicated. That just means that it's complex. And it's complex from a very highly regulated system underpinned by the defense of layers of in-depth and insurance and assurance activity. Now, this next slide is going to be busy. And I do apologize for this, but I was trying to convey to you what I do as an engineer on a submarine and put it onto one slide. So from an operational perspective, every organization, individual person, system that you can see here, I have to interact with and collaborate with on a daily basis to provide assurance for the submarine. The inner circle considers the interaction of operators, the activities, the facilities at the life cycle, and we look at that through that much wider macro lens. The middle ring is looking at the organizations that impact across the different aspects of the life cycle, while the outer ring considers that micro environment. Now, that micro environment is one that's we have to consider that each one of those tenants applies across that micro environment. So this creates a layers within layers within layers. It's a defense in depth and it supports that much wider SSN program. Now, with that slide there, it is also worth appreciating that safety training and regulation applies across every person, every organization, every function. So it's not just the submarine itself, but to have a successful submarine program, that has to apply across that entire organization. And by the way, that's just the organization that I, as the engineer, deal with. There's much bigger than that. So as we come to the end of my time presenting this to you, I want And thank you, by the way, for taking a very whistle-stop tour on what is safety training and regulation, which, by the way, you can do an entire postgraduate degree on each of these individually. But my key message here is our initial thesis was looking at the three keys to the SSN operation. But we also said that they are inter and intra-related. Now, whilst they're explicitly different disciplines, they're implicitly linked. And they need to be implicitly linked to deliver that robust nuclear safety case, assure the team, and deliver what is effectively a nuclear-powered submarine or a nuclear power station in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. So really, rather than looking at it like this, because this slide here actually tells you that it is in silos. This slide here tells you to look at it individually. Think of it like this. We want to be much more holistic. It's got to be underpinned by a future. And that future is one where the operator will consider the safety and the training to satisfy the need of the regulator. That is the insurance and assurance all in one. Ultimately, we need to think of a paradigm shift, and that's got to be a cultural paradigm shift where we consider the three as one, so one ring to rule them all. We need to maintain fidelity across the complexity of this process. And just remember, it's complex, it's not complicated. And we need to do this in order to establish that longer term strategy, the scalability and the flexibility to meet the needs of that future SSN program.